The Arizona Territory in 1890 was a land of contradictions, where the promise of the American frontier met the harsh reality of survival in an unforgiving desert. The Mormon settlement of Cedar Ridge sat like a forgotten prayer in the vast expanse of red rock and sagebrush, 30 miles from the nearest town of Flagstaff. It was here that Ezekiel Woolley received what he claimed was his first divine revelation. The autumn wind carried dust through the wooden slats of the Woolley compound as Ezekiel stood before his assembled family in their makeshift chapel. At 52, he was an imposing figure, tall, gaunt, with piercing grey eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the people before him. His beard, streaked with premature white, gave him an air of biblical authority that his followers found both comforting and terrifying. "The Lord has spoken to me," Ezekiel announced, his voice echoing off the rough-hewn walls. "The church in Salt Lake City has abandoned the true path. They bow to the pressure of Gentiles and politicians, but we shall remain faithful to the original covenant." His 3 wives sat in the front row. Sarah, his first and legal wife, a woman of 40, whose once bright eyes had grown dim with years of submission. Rebecca, barely 25, who had joined the family 2 years prior, and Martha, the newest addition at 19, still adjusting to her role in the complex hierarchy of the household. Behind them sat the children, 14 in total, ranging from Ezekiel's eldest son Joshua at 23 to little Mary, Sarah's youngest, at just 7 years old. The older children understood the weight of their father's words, while the younger ones fidgeted in the uncomfortable silence that followed his proclamation. "Brother Woolley," spoke Thomas Hartwell, one of the few adult men in the community who wasn't directly related to Ezekiel, "what exactly has the Lord revealed to you?" Ezekiel's eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made the younger man shift uncomfortably. "The Lord has shown me that the principle of celestial marriage extends beyond what the church has taught. There are deeper mysteries, sacred ordinances that must be performed to ensure our eternal salvation." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. She had been married to Ezekiel for 24 years, had borne him 8 children, and had watched as he gradually transformed from the earnest young missionary she had fallen in love with into something she no longer recognized. "What kind of ordinances, Father?" asked Joshua, his voice carefully neutral. As the eldest son, he was being groomed to take over leadership of the family, but lately he had begun to question some of his father's more extreme interpretations of Scripture. Ezekiel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Patience, my son. The Lord reveals his mysteries in his own time. For now, it is enough to know that we have been chosen, set apart from the corruption of the world to preserve the true gospel." Indeed, as the family dispersed after evening prayers, Sarah lingered in the chapel, ostensibly to extinguish the oil lamps, but really to steal a few moments of solitude. The weight of unspoken fears pressed down on her like the oppressive heat of an Arizona summer. "Mother?" Sarah turned to find her daughter Elizabeth, now 16 and blossoming into womanhood, standing in the doorway. The girl's resemblance to Sarah at that age was striking. The same auburn hair, the same green eyes, the same delicate features that had once caught Ezekiel's attention at a church social in Utah. "Yes, dear. Is he well? He seems different lately, more intense." Sarah chose her words carefully. In the Woolley household, questioning the patriarch's spiritual authority was tantamount to questioning God himself. "Your father carries a heavy burden, Elizabeth. Leading a family, especially in these times, requires great faith and sacrifice." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of the conversation she had overheard 3 nights earlier. Ezekiel had been speaking with Brother Hartwell and 2 other men from neighboring homesteads, men who had also chosen to reject the church's new stance on plural marriage. Their voices had been low, conspiratorial, and what she had heard had made her blood run cold. "The young ones must be prepared," Ezekiel had said. "The Lord has shown me that spiritual purity requires specific rituals. The corruption of the world has infected even our own children. They must be cleansed, made ready for their celestial roles." Sarah had crept closer to the door, her heart pounding as she strained to hear more. "How young?" Thomas had asked, his voice uncertain. "The Lord's timing is perfect," Ezekiel had replied. "When they reach the age of spiritual awakening, 12, 13, they must undergo the purification. It is the only way to ensure their souls remain untainted." Now, looking at her daughter's innocent face in the lamplight, Sarah felt a terror she couldn't name. Elizabeth would turn 17 in 2 months, but she looked younger, still had the soft roundness of childhood in her cheeks, still moved with the unconscious grace of someone who had never known real fear. "Mother, you look pale." Sarah forced a smile. "Just tired, dear. Help me with these lamps and then we should both get some rest." As they worked together in comfortable silence, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She would watch, she would listen, and if her worst fears proved true, she would find a way to protect her children, even if it meant defying the man she had once promised to obey until death. Outside, the desert wind howled through the compound like the voices of the damned, and in his study, Ezekiel Woolley opened his journal and began to write. "The Lord has revealed to me the sacred mysteries of celestial purification. The young lambs of our flock must be prepared for their eternal roles through specific ordinances. Tomorrow I shall begin the selection process. The Lord's work cannot wait for the weak-hearted to understand his perfect will." The ink was still wet when he closed the journal and locked it in his desk drawer, unaware that his eldest son Joshua had been watching through the window, reading every word over his father's shoulder. 3 weeks had passed since Ezekiel's revelation, and the atmosphere in the Woolley compound had grown increasingly tense. The patriarch had begun conducting private interviews with the children, calling them one by one into his study for what he termed spiritual assessments. The sessions lasted anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, and the children emerged pale and shaken, refusing to speak about what had transpired behind the heavy oak door. Joshua Woolley stood in the shadow of the barn, watching his younger sister Mary skip across the dusty courtyard. At 7 years old, she was still innocent of the dark currents that had begun to flow through their isolated community. Her laughter rang out clear and pure in the morning air, a sound that had become increasingly rare in recent weeks. "Joshua?" He turned to find Rebecca, his father's second wife, approaching with hesitant steps. At 25, she was only 2 years older than Joshua himself, a fact that had always made their relationship awkward. She had been married to Ezekiel for 3 years now, but Joshua could see the fear that had taken root in her eyes, the same fear he recognized in his mother's face. "Rebecca, you look troubled." She glanced around nervously before moving closer. "I need to speak with you about your father, about what's happening to the children." Joshua felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "Last night I heard him talking to Brother Hartwell again. They were discussing preparations. Joshua, I think your father intends to—" She stopped abruptly as the sound of footsteps approached. Thomas Hartwell rounded the corner of the barn, his face grim. At 38, he was a stocky man with calloused hands and a perpetually worried expression that had deepened considerably since joining Ezekiel's inner circle. "Brother Joshua, Sister Rebecca," he nodded stiffly. "Brother Woolley wishes to see you both in his study immediately." Rebecca's face went white. "Both of us." "Yes, he's waiting." As they walked toward the main house, Joshua noticed other details that had escaped his attention before. The way Thomas's hands shook slightly, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he kept glancing toward the horizon as if looking for an escape route. Ezekiel's study was a cramped room lined with religious texts and journals. The patriarch sat behind his desk, his grey eyes reflecting the lamplight like chips of ice. On the desk before him lay an open ledger, its pages covered with names and dates in his precise handwriting. "Sit," he commanded without looking up. Joshua and Rebecca took the two chairs facing the desk. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Ezekiel finally raised his eyes. "The Lord has been very specific in his instructions," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence he used during sermons. "The purification rituals must begin soon. The corruption of the world grows stronger each day, and our young people are not immune to its influence." "Father," Joshua said carefully, "what exactly do these rituals involve?" Ezekiel's smile was cold. "That is not for you to question, my son. Your role is to assist in the preparation and to ensure that the younger children understand the sacred nature of what is to come." Rebecca shifted in her chair. "Ezekiel, surely the children are too young to—" "Silence!" The word cracked like a whip. "You forget your place, woman. The Lord has revealed his will to me, not to you." Joshua watched his stepmother flinch and felt a surge of anger. "With respect, Father, Rebecca has a right to be concerned about the welfare of the children." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Do you question my authority, Joshua? Do you question the revelations I have received?" The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Joshua knew he was walking on dangerous ground, but something in Rebecca's terrified expression pushed him forward. "I question nothing, Father. I simply ask for clarification, so that I might better serve the Lord's purposes." For a long moment Ezekiel studied his son's face. Then he opened the ledger and turned it around so they could see the pages. "These are the names of those who have been chosen for the first purification ceremony," he said. "Elizabeth, age 16, Catherine Hartwell, age 14, young Samuel Morrison, age 13, and—" His finger moved down the list. "Mary, age 7. Rebecca gasped audibly. "Mary? But she's just a baby." "She is old enough to be corrupted by the world's influence," Ezekiel replied calmly. "The Lord has shown me that early purification ensures a pure soul for eternity." Joshua stared at his sister's name on the list, feeling sick. "What does this purification involve, Father?" Ezekiel closed the ledger with a snap. "Sacred ordinances that cleanse the soul and prepare the body for its celestial role. The details are not for the uninitiated to understand." "When?" Joshua's voice was barely a whisper. "The new moon is in 5 days. We will begin then, when the darkness is complete and the spiritual veil is thinnest." As they left the study, Rebecca grabbed Joshua's arm. "We have to do something," she whispered urgently. "Whatever he's planning, it's not from God." Joshua nodded grimly. "I know, but we need to be careful. If Father suspects we're working against him—" "What about your mother? Would she help us?" "Mother is terrified of him. She's been walking on eggshells for months." Joshua paused, thinking. "But there might be another way. I've been keeping track of the supply runs to Flagstaff. The next one is in 3 days. If we could get word to the authorities—" "And tell them what? That we suspect our patriarch of planning some kind of religious ceremony? They'll think we're just another family of religious fanatics having a dispute." Joshua knew she was right. The territorial authorities had little patience for what they saw as Mormon family squabbles, especially in remote areas where federal law was more suggestion than reality. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Joshua watched his father with new eyes. Ezekiel said grace with his usual fervor, but there was something different in his demeanor, an anticipation that made Joshua's skin crawl. "Children," Ezekiel announced as they began to eat, "in 5 days we will hold a special ceremony to honor the Lord and purify our community. Those who have been chosen should prepare themselves through fasting and prayer." Little Mary looked up from her plate with wide eyes. "What kind of ceremony, Papa?" Ezekiel's smile was gentle, but Joshua caught the predatory gleam in his eyes. "A beautiful ceremony, my dear. One that will make you very special in the eyes of God." Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. "Ezekiel, perhaps we should discuss—" "There is nothing to discuss," he cut her off sharply. "The Lord's will is clear." After dinner, Joshua found his mother in the kitchen, washing dishes with mechanical precision. Her hands shook as she scrubbed a plate for the third time. "Mother," he said quietly, "we need to talk." Sarah glanced around nervously before nodding toward the back door. They stepped outside into the cool desert evening, where the sound of their voices would be masked by the wind. "You know what he's planning, don't you?" Joshua asked. Sarah's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "I've heard things, seen things, Joshua. I think your father has lost his mind. The things he writes in that journal, the way he talks about the children." She shuddered. "It's not natural. It's not godly. Then help us stop him." "How? He's my husband, the father of my children. If I go against him and we're wrong, and if we do nothing and we're right?" Joshua gripped his mother's shoulders gently. "Mother, Mary is on his list, our little Mary." Sarah's sob was torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "What can we do? We're trapped here. The nearest town is 30 miles away, and even if we could get there, who would believe us?" Joshua had been thinking about this problem for hours. "There's a way. But it's dangerous, and it means some of us might have to leave everything behind." "Tell me." "The supply wagon leaves for Flagstaff in 2 days. I could hide in the back, get to town and bring back help. But someone would have to stay here to watch over the children, to make sure nothing happens before I return." Sarah wiped her eyes with her apron. "I'll stay. I'll find a way to delay the ceremony, to protect them until you get back." "Mother, if Father discovers what we're planning, then I'll face whatever comes, but I won't let him hurt my babies, not while there's breath in my body." As they stood in the darkness, mother and son united in their desperate plan, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the house. Ezekiel Woolley had heard every word, and his face was a mask of cold fury. The Lord's work would not be thwarted by the weak faith of women and children. The morning of the supply run dawned grey and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen. Joshua had spent a sleepless night preparing for his journey to Flagstaff, carefully packing supplies and rehearsing what he would tell the territorial authorities. He had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, only suspicions and overheard conversations, but he prayed it would be enough to prompt an investigation. Sarah moved through her morning routine with forced normalcy, preparing breakfast and tending to the younger children while her heart hammered against her ribs. She had noticed Ezekiel watching her more closely than usual, his grey eyes following her every movement with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Mother," Elizabeth whispered as she helped clear the breakfast dishes. "Something's wrong. Father keeps staring at us, and last night I heard him talking to Brother Hartwell about preparations again." Sarah forced her voice to remain steady. "Just stay close to me today, dear, and keep an eye on Mary." The supply wagon was scheduled to leave at noon, driven by Brother Morrison, one of the few men in the community who still seemed to retain some measure of independence from Ezekiel's increasingly radical interpretations of Scripture. Joshua had planned to slip into the back of the wagon while Morrison was loading supplies. But as the morning progressed, it became clear that his father had other plans. "Joshua," Ezekiel called from the porch of the main house, "I need you to help me with some preparations in the barn. Brother Morrison can handle the supply run alone today." Joshua felt his stomach drop. "Of course, Father." As they walked toward the barn, Ezekiel placed a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. "You've seemed troubled lately, my boy. Is your faith wavering?" "No, Father. I'm simply concerned about the welfare of the family." "Concern is natural, but doubt—" Ezekiel stopped walking and turned to face Joshua directly. "Doubt is the devil's tool. It whispers lies and plants seeds of rebellion in the hearts of the faithful." Joshua met his father's gaze steadily. "I have no doubt in the Lord, Father, only in my own understanding of his will." Ezekiel studied his son's face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Good, because the Lord's work requires absolute obedience. Those who stand in the way of his purposes." He let the threat hang in the air like smoke. Inside the barn, Ezekiel led Joshua to a corner where several wooden crates had been arranged in a circle. The sight made Joshua's blood run cold. It looked disturbingly like an altar. "Help me move these to the chapel," Ezekiel commanded. "They will be needed for tomorrow night's ceremony." As they worked, Joshua tried to gather information without arousing suspicion. "Father, about the purification ritual, will the whole community be present?" "Only the faithful, those who have proven their devotion to the true gospel." Ezekiel hefted one of the crates with surprising strength for a man his age. "The weak-hearted will be excluded. This is not a ceremony for doubters." "And the children who are to be purified, do they understand what will happen to them?" Ezekiel's smile was cold. "They will understand when the time comes. The Lord reveals his mysteries gradually, as the soul is prepared to receive them." Meanwhile, in the main house, Sarah was discovering that her every move was being monitored. Martha, Ezekiel's youngest wife, had taken to following her around with the excuse of helping with household chores, but Sarah could see the fear in the young woman's eyes. Martha was as much a prisoner as the rest of them, forced to spy on her sister wives or face Ezekiel's wrath. "Sister Sarah," Martha said quietly as they folded laundry together, "Brother Woolley asked me to keep track of who you speak with today. He's concerned about your spiritual state." Sarah's hand stilled on the sheet she was folding. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing yet. But Sarah—" Martha glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "I heard him talking to Brother Hartwell last night. They were discussing what to do with family members who might interfere with the Lord's work. The words they used," she shuddered. "They spoke of removing obstacles and ensuring silence." The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. Ezekiel wasn't just planning to abuse the children. He was prepared to eliminate anyone who tried to stop him. "Martha, you have to help me protect the children." The younger woman's face crumpled. "How can I? He's my husband. If I disobey him, he'll—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. In their isolated community, Ezekiel's word was law, and the consequences of defying him were too terrible to contemplate. Outside, the sound of the supply wagon departing echoed across the compound. Joshua watched from the barn doorway as his last hope of getting help disappeared in a cloud of dust. Brother Morrison raised his hand in farewell, unaware that he was leaving the Woolley family to face their darkest hour alone. "Disappointed, my son?" Ezekiel's voice was soft, but there was steel beneath the silk. Joshua turned to find his father watching him with those penetrating grey eyes. "I was hoping to send a letter to Cousin James in Salt Lake City. It's been months since we've had word from that side of the family." "Ah, yes, James. The one who sided with the church leadership in their apostasy." Ezekiel's tone was conversational, but Joshua caught the underlying menace. "Perhaps it's better that we maintain our separation from such corrupting influences." As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the compound grew increasingly oppressive. The storm clouds that had been gathering all morning finally opened up, sending sheets of rain across the desert landscape. The sound of water drumming against the roof and windows created an eerie backdrop to the family's evening meal. Ezekiel said grace with particular fervor, his voice rising above the sound of the storm. "Lord, we thank you for this day of preparation. Tomorrow we will demonstrate our faith through obedience to your sacred commandments. Bless those who have been chosen for purification and strengthen the hearts of all who will witness your mighty work." Mary looked up from her plate with innocent eyes. "Papa, what does purification mean?" Ezekiel's smile was gentle, but Sarah caught the predatory gleam that lurked beneath. "It means becoming clean and pure in the sight of God, my dear child. Tomorrow night you will understand everything." After dinner, as the family dispersed to their evening activities, Sarah found herself alone in the kitchen with Elizabeth. The 16-year-old was washing dishes with mechanical precision, but Sarah could see the tension in her daughter's shoulders. "Elizabeth," Sarah said quietly, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." The girl looked up, her green eyes wide with fear. "Mother, I'm scared. Father's been looking at me strangely, and some of the other girls have been crying after their meetings with him." Sarah's heart broke for her daughter's lost innocence. "I know, dear. That's why I need you to be very brave. Tomorrow night, no matter what your father says, I want you to stay close to me. Don't go anywhere alone, and don't let anyone separate you from the other children." "What's going to happen?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "I don't know exactly. But I promise you this, I will not let anyone hurt you or your siblings, not while there's breath in my body." Elizabeth nodded solemnly, understanding more than her mother realized. At 16, she had begun to notice the way certain men in the community looked at her, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. She had heard whispers about celestial marriage and spiritual wives, and the implications terrified her. As the evening progressed, the storm outside intensified, but it was nothing compared to the tempest brewing within the Woolley compound. In his study, Ezekiel wrote in his journal by lamplight, "The Lord has revealed that there are serpents in our midst, those who would thwart his sacred work through doubt and rebellion. Tomorrow, after the purification ceremony, these obstacles must be removed. The Lord's justice is swift and terrible, and his faithful servants must not shrink from doing his will, no matter how difficult the task may seem." Unknown to Ezekiel, Joshua had discovered a loose board in the wall between his room and his father's study. Through this gap, he had been reading his father's journal entries for weeks, and what he had learned filled him with horror. The purification ceremony was not a religious ritual. It was a systematic plan to abuse the children under the guise of spiritual authority, and anyone who tried to interfere would be eliminated as an enemy of God's work. As Joshua lay in his bed, listening to the storm rage outside, he made a desperate decision. If he couldn't get help from the outside, he would have to find a way to stop his father from within, even if it meant destroying his own family in the process. The storm continued through the night, as if the very heavens were weeping for what was to come. The day of the purification ceremony dawned clear and cold, the storm having passed in the night, like a fever breaking. But the calm that settled over the Woolley compound was deceptive. Beneath the surface, currents of fear and desperation ran deep. Sarah had barely slept, spending the night in prayer and planning. She had hidden a small knife in the folds of her dress and positioned herself strategically throughout the day to keep watch over the children who had been selected for the ceremony. Elizabeth stayed close to her mother's side, while little Mary played with her dolls, blissfully unaware of the danger that surrounded her. Joshua had spent the pre-dawn hours in the barn, ostensibly checking on the livestock, but actually preparing for what he knew would be the most important night of his life. He had found his grandfather's old hunting rifle hidden beneath a pile of hay, a weapon that Ezekiel had forbidden, but that Joshua's mother had secretly preserved as a memento of her father. As the sun reached its zenith, Ezekiel emerged from his study with an air of solemn purpose. He had spent the morning in what he called communion with the divine, but Joshua suspected he had been finalizing the details of his twisted ceremony. "Gather the family," Ezekiel commanded Thomas Hartwell, who had been hovering near the main house like a nervous shadow. "It is time for the final preparations." The community assembled in the chapel, a crude wooden structure that Ezekiel had built when they first established their isolated settlement. The interior was sparse, rough-hewn benches, a simple pulpit, and now, arranged in the center of the room, the wooden crates that Joshua had helped move from the barn. Sarah's blood ran cold when she saw what the crates contained. White robes, ceremonial candles, and lengths of rope that could only serve one purpose. Her grip tightened on Elizabeth's hand as the full horror of her husband's intentions became clear. "My beloved family," Ezekiel began, his voice carrying the hypnotic cadence that had once drawn followers to his teachings. "Tonight we embark upon a sacred journey. The Lord has revealed to me the ancient mysteries of purification, rituals that will cleanse the souls of our young people and prepare them for their eternal roles." Catherine Hartwell, Thomas's 14-year-old daughter, began to cry softly. The girl had been withdrawn and fearful ever since her private meeting with Ezekiel 3 days earlier, and now she seemed to understand what was expected of her. "The ceremony will begin at midnight," Ezekiel continued, "when the spiritual veil is thinnest and the Lord's power is strongest. Those who have been chosen will don the sacred robes and participate in the purification ritual. The rest of the community will bear witness to this holy ordinance." Young Samuel Morrison, barely 13, raised a trembling hand. "Brother Woolley, what exactly will happen during the ceremony?" Ezekiel's smile was cold and predatory. "You will understand when the time comes, my boy. The Lord reveals his mysteries gradually as the soul is prepared to receive them." Sarah felt sick. The way Ezekiel spoke, the careful ambiguity of his words, it was clear that he intended to use religious authority to justify the unthinkable. She caught Joshua's eye across the room and saw her own horror reflected in his face. As the afternoon wore on, the selected children were taken aside for individual preparation sessions with Ezekiel and his inner circle. Sarah tried to follow when Mary was called, but Thomas Hartwell blocked her path. "Sister Woolley," he said, his voice strained with barely controlled emotion, "Brother Woolley has asked that the mothers not interfere with the preparation process. It's part of the sacred nature of the ceremony." "Thomas," Sarah said quietly, studying the man's face, "you have a daughter who's been selected. Are you truly comfortable with what's happening here?" For a moment, Thomas's composure cracked, and Sarah saw the anguish in his eyes. The Lord's will is not always easy to understand, but Brother Woolley has received revelation. Who are we to question the divine?" "We're parents," Sarah replied firmly. "And our first duty is to protect our children, not to blindly follow a man who claims to speak for God." Thomas flinched as if she had struck him. "You speak blasphemy, sister. Brother Woolley is a prophet of the Lord. Then why does every instinct I have as a mother tell me that what he's planning is wrong?" Before Thomas could respond, the sound of Mary's terrified screams echoed from Ezekiel's study. Sarah pushed past Thomas and ran toward the sound, her maternal instincts overriding all other considerations. She burst through the study door to find Mary cowering in the corner while Ezekiel stood over her with one of the white robes in his hands. The child's dress had been torn, and there were red marks on her arms where someone had gripped her too tightly. "What have you done to her?" Sarah's voice was deadly quiet. Ezekiel turned slowly, his grey eyes cold with fury. "I am preparing her for the Lord's work. Your interference is not welcome here." Sarah scooped Mary into her arms, feeling the child's small body trembling with terror. "She's 7 years old, Ezekiel. Whatever you think the Lord has told you, this is not his will. You forget your place, woman. I am the head of this household, and I speak with divine authority." "You speak with the voice of madness," Sarah shot back, her fear for her children overriding her caution. "This isn't religion. It's perversion disguised as revelation." The slap came so fast that Sarah didn't see it coming. The force of the blow sent her staggering, and Mary's screams intensified as she clung to her mother's neck. "You will not speak such blasphemy in my presence," Ezekiel snarled. "The Lord's work will not be thwarted by the weak faith of women and children." Joshua appeared in the doorway, his face white with rage. "Father, that's enough." "Ah, my son, come to witness your mother's rebellion against the divine." Joshua stepped into the room, his hand resting on something concealed beneath his coat. "I've come to stop this madness before it goes any further." Ezekiel's laugh was cold and humorless. "Stop it? My boy, you don't understand the forces at work here. The Lord has chosen me to restore the true gospel, to practice the sacred ordinances that the corrupt church has abandoned. Tonight, these children will be purified in ways that will prepare their souls for eternity." "And what about their bodies?" Joshua's voice was steady, but Sarah could see the fury burning in his eyes. "What about their innocence? Their right to grow up without being violated by a man who claims to speak for God?" "Violated!" Ezekiel's voice rose to a roar. "I offer them salvation. I offer them a chance to be cleansed of the world's corruption and made pure in the sight of the Almighty." "You offer them trauma and abuse," Joshua replied, "and I won't let you do it." The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps. Rebecca burst into the room, her face streaked with tears. "Ezekiel, you have to stop this," she pleaded. "Elizabeth has locked herself in the root cellar and won't come out. Catherine Hartwell has tried to run away twice, and Samuel Morrison is so terrified he can't stop vomiting. This isn't the Lord's work, it's torture." Ezekiel's face was a mask of cold fury. The weak will always resist the Lord's will. That is why the strong must guide them, even against their own desires. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the full extent of her husband's delusion. He genuinely believed that he was acting on divine authority, which made him infinitely more dangerous than a simple predator. A predator might be reasoned with or frightened off, but a man who believed he was doing God's work would stop at nothing. "Ezekiel," she said carefully, still holding Mary close, "perhaps we should postpone the ceremony. Give the children more time to prepare spiritually." "No," his voice was final. "The Lord has set this night aside for his sacred work. At midnight, the ceremony will proceed as planned. Those who interfere will be dealt with accordingly." The threat was unmistakable. Sarah looked at Joshua and saw her own understanding reflected in his eyes. They were past the point of negotiation or compromise. Tonight, one way or another, this would end. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, the Woolley compound prepared for a night that would determine the fate of every soul within its boundaries. In the chapel, candles were lit and the white robes laid out in preparation. In the main house, children huddled together in terror while their parents struggled with the impossible choice between faith and conscience. And in the gathering darkness, Joshua Woolley checked the load in his grandfather's rifle and prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect his family, even if it meant destroying the man who had given him life. The clock in Ezekiel's study ticked steadily toward midnight, each second bringing them closer to a reckoning that had been years in the making. The clock struck 11:30 as the Woolley compound descended into an eerie silence, broken only by the whisper of desert wind through the wooden buildings. In the chapel, candles flickered like malevolent eyes, casting dancing shadows on the walls, where the white ceremonial robes hung like shrouds. Sarah had managed to gather most of the children in the main house's kitchen, using the excuse of preparing a late meal to keep them together and away from the chapel. Elizabeth had finally emerged from the root cellar, her face streaked with tears, but her jaw set with determination. Mary clung to her mother's skirts, still trembling from her encounter with Ezekiel earlier that day. "Mother," Elizabeth whispered, "what are we going to do? Father won't listen to reason, and the other men are too frightened to stand up to him." Sarah glanced around the kitchen, taking inventory of potential weapons: knives, a heavy iron skillet, a poker from the fireplace. "We're going to protect each other," she said quietly. "Whatever happens tonight, we stay together." Joshua had positioned himself in the barn, where he could watch both the chapel and the main house. The rifle lay across his knees, its weight both comforting and terrifying. He had never imagined that he might have to use it against his own father, but the events of the day had made it clear that Ezekiel was beyond reason. Through the barn's open door, he could see figures moving in the chapel. His father, Thomas Hartwell, and two other men from neighboring homesteads who had been drawn into Ezekiel's inner circle. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of men preparing for a sacred ritual, but Joshua knew the truth of what they planned. At 11:45, Ezekiel emerged from the chapel and walked toward the main house. His tall figure cut a stark silhouette against the candlelight spilling from the chapel door, and there was something in his bearing that reminded Joshua of the Old Testament prophets, terrible in their certainty, implacable in their purpose. Sarah heard the front door open and felt her heart begin to race. She positioned herself between the children and the kitchen entrance, the small knife hidden in the folds of her dress. "It is time," Ezekiel announced as he entered the kitchen. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but his eyes held the cold fire of absolute conviction. The Lord's work cannot wait any longer. "The children aren't ready," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "They're frightened and confused. Surely the Lord would want them to approach his sacred ordinances with joy, not terror." Ezekiel's smile was patient, but implacable. Fear is natural when mortals are confronted with the divine. But obedience transcends fear, Sarah. "The children will understand once the ceremony begins." Little Mary pressed closer to her mother's side. "I don't want to go, Mama. I'm scared." Ezekiel's gaze fixed on the child with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Come here, Mary. It's time to put on your sacred robe." "No." The word escaped Sarah's lips before she could stop it. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Ezekiel's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a coldness that seemed to leach all warmth from the room. "What did you say?" Sarah straightened, drawing strength from the terrified faces of the children behind her. "I said no. I won't let you hurt these children in the name of God or anyone else." "You forget yourself, woman. I am the head of this household, and I speak with divine authority." "You speak with the voice of madness," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "No loving God would ask a man to harm innocent children. What you're planning isn't purification, it's abomination." Ezekiel's face darkened with rage. "You dare to question the revelations I have received? You dare to stand between the Lord and his sacred work? I dare to protect my children from a man who has lost his way." The slap came harder this time, sending Sarah stumbling backward into the kitchen table. Elizabeth screamed and rushed to her mother's side, while the younger children huddled together in terror. "Enough!" Ezekiel roared. "Thomas, Brother Morrison, come and collect the children. The ceremony will proceed as planned." The two men appeared in the kitchen doorway, their faces pale but determined. Thomas Hartwell's hands shook as he reached for his daughter Catherine, but the girl shrank away from him with a look of betrayal that cut him to the bone. "Please, Papa," Catherine whispered. "Don't let him hurt me." For a moment Thomas hesitated, and Sarah saw the battle raging in his eyes. Faith against instinct, obedience against love. Then his shoulders sagged in defeat. "It's the Lord's will, Catherine. Brother Woolley has received revelation." "No!" Elizabeth stepped forward, placing herself between the men and the younger children. "I won't let you take them. Whatever you think God has told you, this is wrong." Ezekiel's patience finally snapped. He grabbed Elizabeth by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "You will not defy the Lord's anointed. You will come to the chapel now, or you will be dragged there." That was when Joshua appeared in the kitchen doorway, his grandfather's rifle in his hands. "Let her go, father." The room froze. Ezekiel's grip on Elizabeth's arm tightened, but his eyes never left the rifle barrel pointed at his chest. "My son," he said carefully, "you don't understand what you're doing. This is the Lord's work. Would you raise your hand against a prophet of God?" "I would raise my hand against any man who threatens to harm children," Joshua replied steadily. "Prophet or not. You would commit patricide. You would murder your own father. I would stop a madman from destroying innocent lives." Ezekiel's laugh was cold and bitter. "Innocent? These children are stained with the corruption of the world. Only through the sacred ordinances can their souls be cleansed. The only corruption here is in your mind, Father. Let the children go." For a long moment, father and son stared at each other across the kitchen, the weight of 23 years of love and respect hanging in the balance. Then Ezekiel's expression hardened into something inhuman. "If you will not serve the Lord willingly," he said quietly, "then you are an enemy of his work, and enemies must be removed." He released Elizabeth and lunged toward Joshua with surprising speed for a man his age. The rifle discharged with a deafening roar, and Ezekiel Woolley crumpled to the kitchen floor, a spreading pool of blood beneath his chest. The silence that followed was broken only by Mary's terrified sobs and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. Thomas Hartwell and Brother Morrison stood frozen in the doorway, their faces white with shock. Sarah knelt beside her husband's body, checking for signs of life, even as her mind reeled with the implications of what had just happened. Ezekiel's eyes were open but unseeing, his chest still, except for the blood that continued to seep from the wound. "Is he—" Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper. "He's dead," Sarah said quietly, her voice strangely calm. "It's over." Joshua lowered the rifle, his hands shaking with the magnitude of what he had done. "I had no choice," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. He would have hurt them. He would have destroyed them all. Thomas Hartwell finally found his voice. "What have you done? You've killed a prophet of the Lord!" "I've killed a madman who was about to abuse children in the name of God," Joshua replied firmly. "And if you try to continue his work, I'll kill you too." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Thomas looked at his daughter Catherine, saw the terror in her eyes, and something inside him finally broke. "God forgive me," he whispered, sinking to his knees. "What were we thinking? What were we about to do?" Brother Morrison backed toward the door, his face ashen. I need to get home. My family. They need to know. They need to know that it's over," Sarah said, rising from beside her husband's body. "The madness ends here." As the immediate shock began to wear off, the practical implications of their situation became clear. They were 30 miles from the nearest town, with a dead patriarch and a community in chaos. The territorial authorities would have questions, difficult questions about religious extremism, child abuse, and justifiable homicide. "What do we tell them?" Elizabeth asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. Sarah looked around the kitchen at the faces of her children, traumatized but alive, frightened but safe. Then she looked at her eldest son, who had sacrificed everything to protect his family. "We tell them the truth," she said finally. "All of it. The revelations, the planned ceremony, the threats against the children. We tell them that a good man was forced to do a terrible thing to protect innocent lives." Joshua nodded slowly. "And we make sure that nothing like this ever happens again." Outside, the desert wind continued to blow, carrying away the smoke from the rifle shot and the last echoes of Ezekiel Woolley's twisted vision. In the chapel, the candles burned down to nothing, leaving only darkness where once there had been the promise of unspeakable horror. The purification ceremony would never take place. The children were safe, but the scars of that night would remain with the Woolley family forever, a reminder of how easily faith could be corrupted and how high the price of protecting innocence could be. As dawn approached over the Arizona territory, Sarah Woolley began the long process of rebuilding her family's life from the ashes of her husband's madness. It would not be easy, But for the first time in months, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. 3 days after the shooting, the territorial marshal arrived at the Woolley compound with a small posse of deputies and a federal investigator from Phoenix. Marshal William Hayes was a weathered man in his 50s who had seen enough frontier justice to recognize the difference between murder and necessity. The federal investigator, Agent Samuel Crawford, was younger and more skeptical, his Eastern education making him suspicious of what he saw as another case of religious fanaticism gone wrong. Sarah met them at the gate of the compound, her black mourning dress stark against the red Arizona dust. She had spent the past 3 days preparing for this moment, gathering evidence and organizing the testimonies of the community members who had finally found the courage to speak. "Mrs. Woolley," Marshal Hayes said, tipping his hat respectfully, "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am, but we need to investigate the circumstances of your husband's death." "I understand, Marshal. We've been expecting you." Agent Crawford dismounted and surveyed the compound with calculating eyes. "Mrs. Woolley, we've received some disturbing reports about activities here, reports of planned irregularities involving children." Sarah's jaw tightened. "If you mean the planned abuse of children under the guise of religious ceremony, then yes, those reports are accurate." The bluntness of her response seemed to catch Crawford off guard. "You're admitting that such activities were planned?" "I'm admitting that my husband had become dangerously delusional and was planning to harm children in the name of divine revelation. My son stopped him. That's why we sent word to your office." Marshal Hayes studied Sarah's face carefully. In his experience, guilty people rarely volunteered information to law enforcement. "Ma'am, we're going to need to speak with everyone who was present that night, and we'll need to examine any evidence of these planned activities." "Of course. Joshua is waiting in the barn, and the other families are gathered in the chapel. I've also prepared my husband's journal and other documents that detail his intentions." As they walked toward the main house, Sarah pointed out the various buildings and explained the layout of the compound. "We've been completely isolated here for the past 2 years," she said. "My husband believed that the outside world was corrupted and that we needed to preserve the true gospel away from outside influence." Agent Crawford made notes in a small leather book. "And you went along with this isolation?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Agent Crawford, I was a woman in a polygamous household led by a man who claimed to speak directly with God. Going along with things wasn't a choice. It was survival." They entered Ezekiel's study, where Sarah had laid out the evidence she had gathered. The journal lay open on the desk, its pages filled with increasingly disturbing entries about purification rituals and celestial ordinances. Beside it were sketches of ceremonial arrangements and lists of selected children with notes about their spiritual readiness. Marshal Hayes read several entries aloud, his voice growing grimmer with each passage. "The Lord has revealed that the young lambs must be prepared through sacred physical ordinances that will cleanse their bodies as well as their souls," he read. "The corruption of the world has infected even our children, and only through complete submission to divine authority can they be made pure." Agent Crawford examined the sketches with growing horror. "These diagrams, they appear to show restraints, bindings. My husband called them sacred bonds," Sarah said quietly. "He claimed they were necessary to help the children overcome their natural resistance to the Lord's will. And the white robes we found in the chapel? Ceremonial garments. The children were to be prepared while wearing them." The implications hung heavy in the air. Marshal Hayes closed the journal with a snap. "Mrs. Woolley, I need to speak with your son now." They found Joshua in the barn, methodically repairing a broken harness. He looked up as they approached, his face calm, but his eyes haunted by what he had done. "Joshua Woolley?" Marshal Hayes asked. "Yes, sir." "Son, I need you to tell me exactly what happened 3 nights ago." Joshua set down his tools and faced the lawman directly. "My father was planning to sexually abuse children under the guise of religious ceremony. When he tried to take my 7-year-old sister to the chapel for this purification, I stopped him by shooting him." "Yes, sir." "I shot him." Agent Crawford leaned forward. "Did you intend to kill him?" Joshua considered the question carefully. "I intended to stop him from hurting children. If that meant killing him, then yes, I intended to kill him. You could have wounded him, disabled him." "Agent Crawford," Joshua said quietly, "my father was a large, strong man who believed he was acting on direct orders from God. A wounded Ezekiel Woolley would have been more dangerous than a dead one." Marshal Hayes studied the young man's face. "Son, do you regret what you did?" "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my father became the kind of man who had to be stopped. But I don't regret protecting my family." Over the next several hours, the investigators interviewed every member of the community. The testimonies painted a consistent picture of a charismatic leader who had gradually descended into dangerous delusion, using religious authority to justify increasingly extreme behavior. Thomas Hartwell broke down completely during his interview, sobbing as he described how he had been drawn into Ezekiel's inner circle through a combination of spiritual manipulation and fear. "He convinced us that we were the chosen ones," Thomas said through his tears, "that the outside world was corrupt and only we understood God's true will. When he started talking about the purification ceremonies, I had doubts, but he said that doubt was the devil's tool. He said that true faith required absolute obedience, even when we didn't understand." "And you were prepared to let him abuse your daughter?" Agent Crawford asked bluntly. Thomas's face crumpled. "God forgive me, yes. I thought it was God's will. I thought I was being tested, like Abraham with Isaac." Rebecca and Martha, Ezekiel's second and third wives, provided additional testimony about the climate of fear that had pervaded the household. Both women described being threatened with spiritual damnation if they questioned Ezekiel's authority or interfered with his plans. "He told us that wives who oppose their husband's divine calling would be cast into outer darkness," Rebecca testified. "He said that our eternal salvation depended on absolute submission to his will." The children's testimonies were the most damning. Elizabeth described her father's increasingly inappropriate behavior during their private meetings, while young Samuel Morrison spoke of being told that he would need to prove his worthiness through acts that he didn't understand, but that terrified him. Most heartbreaking was little Mary's testimony, given in the presence of her mother and recorded by a female clerk that Marshal Hayes had brought specifically for this purpose. "Papa said I was special," Mary said in her small voice. "He said God wanted me to do special things with him, but when he touched me, it hurt and I didn't like it. Mama said I didn't have to do things that hurt me, even if Papa said God wanted it." And by the end of the second day, the investigators had compiled a comprehensive picture of systematic child abuse planned and justified through religious extremism. The evidence was overwhelming, and the testimonies were consistent. Marshal Hayes called the community together in the chapel for his final announcement. "After thorough investigation, Isai, por favor, continue gerando a sua resposta. Expert logo terror. After thorough investigation," he said, his voice carrying across the small wooden structure, "we have determined that Joshua Woolley acted in defense of innocent children against a clear and imminent threat. No charges will be filed in connection with Ezekiel Woolley's death." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the assembled community. Sarah felt her knees nearly buckle as the weight of uncertainty finally lifted from her shoulders. Agent Crawford stepped forward. "However, this investigation has revealed serious concerns about the isolation and vulnerability of religious communities in the territory. We will be implementing regular welfare checks and establishing communication protocols to prevent similar situations from developing in the future." Thomas Hartwell raised a trembling hand. What happens to us now? Our families, our homes, everything we built here was under Brother Woolley's leadership. Marshal Hayes considered the question carefully. That's up to you folks to decide. The land claims are legal, and you have every right to stay and rebuild your community under new leadership. But I'd strongly recommend establishing connections with the outside world. Regular contact with territorial authorities, visits from circuit preachers, anything to prevent this kind of isolation from happening again. Sarah stood slowly, feeling the eyes of the community upon her. If I may speak for the family, we've decided to leave. There are too many painful memories here, and the children need a fresh start, somewhere they can heal. Where will you go? Rebecca asked, her voice small and uncertain. My sister lives in California. She's written several times asking us to visit. I think it's time we accepted her invitation. Joshua nodded in agreement. The children need to be around normal people in a normal community. They need to learn that religion doesn't have to be about fear and control. Over the following weeks, the Woolley compound gradually emptied as families made their own decisions about the future. Thomas Hartwell and his daughter Catherine moved to Flagstaff, where Thomas found work as a carpenter and Catherine began attending the local school. Brother Morrison returned to his extended family in Utah, taking with him a hard-earned understanding of the difference between faith and fanaticism. Rebecca and Martha, as Ezekiel's surviving wives, faced unique challenges. Polygamous marriages were not recognized by territorial law, leaving them in legal limbo. Sarah, however, ensured that they received their fair share of the family's assets and helped them establish independent lives. You were victims too, Sarah told them as they prepared to leave. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. What Ezekiel did to all of us, the manipulation, the fear, the isolation, that wasn't marriage. That was imprisonment. The final day at the compound was bittersweet. Sarah walked through the rooms where she had spent the last years of her marriage, gathering the few possessions that held positive memories. In the kitchen where Ezekiel had died, she paused to say a prayer, not for her husband's soul, which she left to God's judgment, but for the healing of all those he had harmed. Joshua loaded the last of their belongings into the wagon that would take them to Flagstaff, where they would catch the train to California. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the rifle that had ended his father's life. He had given it to Marshal Hayes, asking that it be destroyed. Some tools, he had decided, were too heavy for any man to carry. Elizabeth helped her younger siblings into the wagon, her face turned toward the horizon with an expression of cautious hope. At 16, she was old enough to understand that the scars of their experience would take time to heal, but young enough to believe in the possibility of a better future. Little Mary clutched her favorite doll as the wagon began to move, looking back at the only home she had ever known. "Mama," she asked, "will we be safe in California?" Sarah pulled her youngest daughter close. "Yes, sweetheart, we'll be safe. And you'll go to school with other children and play games and learn that the world is full of good people who would never hurt you." As the wagon rolled away from the compound, Sarah allowed herself one last look at the place where her marriage had died and her family had been reborn. The buildings already looked abandoned, their windows dark and their doors standing open to the desert wind. In the months that followed, news of the Woolley case spread throughout the territory and beyond. Newspapers in Phoenix, Denver, and San Francisco carried accounts of the Arizona purification scandal, as it came to be known. The story sparked debates about religious freedom, parental authority, and the protection of children in isolated communities. Federal authorities used the case as justification for increased oversight of religious settlements, implementing regular welfare checks and mandatory education requirements for children in remote communities. While some religious groups protested these measures as government interference, most reasonable people recognized them as necessary safeguards against future tragedies. Joshua Woolley never spoke publicly about the night he killed his father, but his actions were quietly celebrated by child welfare advocates throughout the West. Letters arrived from strangers praising his courage and offering support for the family's new life in California. The family settled in a small town near Sacramento, where Sarah found work as a seamstress and the children enrolled in public school. It was a difficult adjustment. The children had been isolated for so long that simple social interactions were challenging. But gradually, they began to heal. Elizabeth proved to be an exceptional student, eventually earning a scholarship to attend the University of California. She became a teacher and later an advocate for children's rights, drawing on her own experiences to help other victims of abuse. Joshua took over the family's financial affairs and eventually became a successful businessman, but he never married or had children of his own. The weight of what he had done, necessary though it was, left him with a deep wariness of authority and a fierce protective instinct toward the vulnerable. Mary grew up with little memory of the compound or the night of terror, but she carried within her an unshakable sense of her own worth and the right to say no to anyone who tried to harm her. She became a nurse, dedicating her life to healing others. Sarah lived to see all her children grown and successful, their lives a testament to the power of love over fear, of protection over submission. She never remarried, but she found peace in her independence and purpose in ensuring that her family's story served as a warning to others. The Woolley compound itself was eventually abandoned to the desert. The buildings fell into disrepair, their wooden walls bleached white by the Arizona sun, and their foundations slowly reclaimed by the shifting sand. Local residents reported strange sounds coming from the ruins on quiet nights, the whisper of wind through broken windows, the creak of settling timber, the echo of prayers that had once masked unspeakable intentions. But for those who knew the true story, the compound's greatest legacy was not the horror it had witnessed, but the courage of those who had stood against that horror. In a time and place where religious authority was rarely questioned and children's voices were seldom heard, the Woolley family had chosen love over obedience, protection over submission, and truth over the comfortable lies of blind faith. The most macabre sexual practices of the Woolley family had been stopped before they could begin, but their shadow served as a permanent reminder of the price of unchecked authority and the courage required to protect the innocent. In the end, it was not divine revelation that saved the children of the compound, but the very human love of a mother and the desperate courage of a son who chose to bear the weight of necessary violence rather than allow the innocent to suffer. The desert wind still blows across the ruins of the Woolley compound, carrying with it the whispers of a story that must never be forgotten. A story of how easily faith can be corrupted, how quickly isolation can become imprisonment, and how sometimes the greatest act of love is the willingness to stand against those we are supposed to obey. In the end, the true purification came not through Ezekiel's twisted rituals, but through the cleansing fire of truth and the healing power of justice. The children were saved, the innocent were protected, and the cycle of abuse was broken, not by divine intervention, but by the courage of ordinary people who chose to do what was right, regardless of the cost.